The seed catalog my mother ordered from in 1972 is still in a drawer in the farmhouse kitchen. The meadow that grew out of it was still 30 feet wide and blooming in its usual order the morning my brother signed a purchase agreement for the land underneath it. Land he did not yet know had already been spoken for. But this story starts 3 years before that morning, on a Thursday afternoon in April, when my parents sat me down at their kitchen table with a legal pad full of questions. I run the Millhaven Land Trust. I have for 14 years now, since I was 30 years old, and the one document I understand better than almost anyone in this state is the conservation easement, a legal instrument that permanently restricts what can be done with a piece of land, regardless of who comes to own it after the person who signed it is gone. My name is Eleanor Garrett. I am 44. My brother Dale did not grow up wanting to understand instruments like that. He grew up wanting to leave, the way a lot of people who grow up on working land want to leave it. And he did leave, at 20, for an engineering degree and a career and a suburb 3 hours from the farmstead where we were raised. He came home for holidays. He loved that land the way you love something from a comfortable distance, warmly, intermittently, without the daily weight of it. I came home too, but I never really left. I lived 12 minutes from the farmhouse. I had dinner with my parents on Sunday evenings for 18 years, and somewhere in those 18 years, without either of us quite deciding it on purpose, I became the child who understood what the land actually was, and Dale became the child who would eventually inherit it without that understanding. Dale married Tina the year after he finished his degree, and Tina had grown up in a suburb of a different state entirely, with no working land in her family at all, which, I don't say as a criticism, it is simply true, and it shaped things. She was warm to my parents in the generic, appropriate way people are warm to in-laws they see twice a year, and she was never unkind about the farm, but she also never once, in all the years I knew her before any of this happened, asked my mother a single question about the meadow, or the well, or why the barn was built the way it was built. Dale himself could still, even at 40, name every tool in that barn and what it was for. He had simply stopped being the kind of person who thought about the land on a daily basis, the way you stop thinking in a language you no longer speak at home, even if you could still get by in it if you had to. Welcome back to our channel. This is where the long stories get told all the way through, from the first document to the last, without shortcuts. If quiet decisions with permanent consequences are your kind of story, you are in exactly the right place. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight, and hit subscribe so the next one finds you. Now let me take you back to the beginning of this one. The Millhaven Land Trust was founded in 1991 by a retired agricultural engineer named Gordon Mast, who had watched the county's farmland disappear into subdivisions at a pace he considered permanent and irreversible. He believed a piece of farmland, once converted to residential lots, would never be farmland again in any meaningful time frame, that the conversion wasn't a development decision, but a forever decision, and forever decisions deserved at least as much consideration as the tax incentives and developer interest that usually drove them. He built the trust as an alternative. Rather than selling to develop, a landowner could grant a conservation easement, voluntarily and permanently restricting development in exchange for a tax deduction and the guarantee that the land would remain what it was. The easement runs with the land forever. Any future owner, however they came to own it, is bound by the same restrictions the original owner accepted. The land does not renegotiate with future markets. Gordon Mast understood that some decisions are too permanent to leave to people who weren't there to make them. I joined the trust as a program coordinator 20 years ago, fresh out of a graduate program in environmental studies. I became executive director at 30. I have overseen 47 conservation easements in this county in the years since. I know the instrument better than almost anyone in the state. I have sat at tables with landowners who were grieving, or uncertain, or simply tired, and needed someone to walk them through exactly what they were signing and what it would mean for their children and their children's children. I answer those questions plainly and completely and let people decide for themselves, because that is the only way this work is done right. I did not, in 14 years of doing it, ever imagine I would one day explain the instrument I work with every single day to my own brother, standing in the field where we grew up, while he held a purchase agreement that was already worthless. I want to say one more thing about the work itself before I go further, because it matters to everything that follows. When a landowner comes to the trust asking about an easement, they are rarely in a simple position. They love the land. They also have children who may not want to keep it, or a mortgage that needs paying, or siblings who see the property as capital rather than as ground. The long, ordinary human fact that the person who cares most about a piece of land is not always the one who ends up owning it. They come to us holding all of that, and they want to know whether there is a way to make the thing they love permanent. I tell them yes, there is a way, but it requires choosing it now, while they still can, and accepting that they are making a decision on behalf of people who are not yet at the table. Some landowners hear that and say it feels like too much to impose on the future. Others hear it and say, that is exactly the point. My parents were the second kind. I always knew that about them in a general way. I just did not know, until a Thursday afternoon in April, that they had already decided to act on it. Henry and Bess Garrett bought the 22-acre property in 1969, 2 years after their wedding, when farmland in this county was cheap, and the house on it needed more work than most buyers wanted to take on. My father could do the work. He'd grown up on a working farm and knew how to do every physical thing a farm required. He fixed the roof. He replaced the well. He rebuilt the barn with lumber he milled himself from trees on the back of the property. My mother planted a kitchen garden the first spring and a cutting garden the second, and by the third spring she had ordered seed from a catalog and laid out a meadow along the east fence line, 30 feet wide, entirely her own design, a long, slow wash of wildflowers and prairie grasses, blooming in rotating sequence from April clear through October. She could name every plant in it. She could tell you which ones came from that original seed order and which had seeded themselves in the years since and which had simply arrived on the wind from somewhere she'd never been. She loved that meadow, the particular way people love something they built from nothing that will keep going after they're gone. There is a Sunday in late September I still carry around with me, the texture of something important even before I understood what it meant. I was maybe 10. My father had just finished cutting the hay in the south field, and we were all outside in the late afternoon, and my mother walked the full length of the meadow, naming things as she went, not for any occasion. She just walked slowly and said the names out loud. Here is the ironweed. Here is the wild bergamot. Here is the pale purple coneflower. This one came from the packet ordered out of Minnesota. She wasn't performing it for us. She was keeping the record, the way she kept every record, carefully and completely, on the theory that someone would eventually want to know. I was 10 and bored by the second quarter of the meadow, thinking about something else entirely, and then I looked back from the fence post at the end and saw her still out there in the middle of the grasses, with her hand resting on a stem of something purple, and some part of me even then understood, she is making sure this is real. She is making sure this exists, on the record, whether or not anyone else is paying attention. June Pickett's family has farmed the property next to ours since before either of our families can precisely date, and she and my mother shared the particular friendship of two women who worked adjoining land and therefore always had a legitimate, unglamorous reason to see each other. A fence question, a machinery loan, a late-season frost warning passed along before the county's own alert system caught up to it. They were not the kind of friends who called each other on the phone to talk about their feelings. They were the kind of friends who showed up with tomatoes when they had too many, and stood in a kitchen for 20 minutes, and left having said everything that actually needed saying without ever really naming it. Grew up assuming this was simply what friendship was. Practical, mostly wordless, entirely reliable, and it took me a long time as an adult to understand that this had been a specific choice on both their parts, not a default setting available to everyone. We grew up on that land, Dale and I, 2 years apart, the way children understand the place that shaped them, not as a category of thing but as a specific place with its own texture and smell and seasonal logic. I knew which side of the barn stayed warmest in November. Dale knew where the creek ran fastest after rain. We carried those things into our adult lives without quite knowing we were carrying them, in the body rather than the mind, until something eventually surfaces them again. I had dinner with my parents on Sunday evenings for 18 years. What those 18 years actually were is something I have thought about carefully since my mother died, because at the time, I took them for granted the way you take for granted anything that seems structurally permanent. I showed up. My mother cooked something. My father asked about work. We talked about the land, what was coming in, what needed fixing, what the neighbor's fence was doing, whether the creek had moved after the last hard rain. Then I drove 12 minutes home and expected to do it again in 7 days. 900 Sunday evenings, more or less, at the same table, on the same piece of ground. What I understand now, and did not understand then, is that my father was using those dinners to keep me current, not on family news, but on the land itself, mentioning things about the property as though they were incidental details of the week, when really, he was updating my knowledge of it the way you maintain a document, deliberately, on purpose. I think he always suspected I would be the one who eventually needed to know it cold. The conversation that started all of this happened on a Thursday afternoon in April, 3 years before my parents died. I had stopped by after work, an ordinary visit, and my mother had made tea, and my father was at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a list of questions. This was his method for any conversation he considered important. Spend a day or two writing down what he wanted to say, cross out the redundant parts, arrive with a list already edited down to what mattered. He had been editing this particular list, I could tell, for a while. The question he'd finally landed on was specific. Could the land trust place a conservation easement on their property, and if so, what would it mean for the land, and for us, after they were gone? I sat down and told them everything. I walked them through the instrument, what it restricts, what it doesn't. I told them it would be recorded at the county recorder's office and would run with the land through any future sale, inheritance, or bequest, binding whoever came to own it after them, under any circumstances, to the same restrictions they were accepting now. I told them the easement would allow the house to remain, to be occupied, to be sold as a residence. It would restrict subdivision and most commercial development. It would not prevent Dale or me from living there, renting it, or passing it down. It would prevent a developer from buying the land and turning it into 14 residential lots. My father asked whether it was reversible. I said it was not. He nodded and crossed something off the legal pad. He asked whether Dale and I could override it later if we both agreed. I said no. The restriction runs with the land, regardless of what any owner, present or future, decides. He crossed off something else. He asked whether the land would be worth less as a result. I said yes, very likely. Without development potential, the market value would reflect residential use only, not subdivision potential. He said that made sense. He said that was what the land was actually for, so the value should reflect what it was actually for. I have quoted him on that more times than I can count since. He was not a complicated man, my father. He was an unusually clear one. He asked one more question before he set the legal pad down entirely, and it's the one I've thought about most in the years since. He asked whether placing the easement now, while they were both still healthy, was different in some legal or moral sense from waiting and letting it pass through the will instead. I told him it was different in a very specific way. An easement placed now, by them, while competent and of sound mind and able to answer any question about their own intentions, was airtight in a way that almost nothing accomplished after death ever fully is. A will can be contested. Intentions expressed only after someone is gone can be argued about, reinterpreted, softened in the retelling. A recorded instrument, signed and notarized while the person who signed it can still explain exactly what they meant by it, doesn't have that vulnerability. He sat with that for a while. So if we wait, he said, it's weaker, even if we still mean it just as much. I told him that was essentially correct. He nodded once, the particular nod he used when a decision had just finished making itself in his head, and picked the pen back up. My mother asked only one question. Would the meadow be protected? I said yes. She said, that's the part I care about most, quietly. And that was the entirety of what she said on the subject that afternoon. I want to describe the drive home from Neil Ash's office the day they signed, because I have not told this part to many people, and it belongs here. Neil is our trust's attorney, and he prepared the instrument, and my parents reviewed it with him and signed it on a Tuesday morning, both of them, in person, with a notary physically present. He filed it at the county recorder's office that same afternoon. I drove home the long way afterward, the way that passes the farmstead, and I slowed along the front field and looked at the meadow through the fence line and thought about what had just happened. My parents had signed a document that meant that meadow would not become a housing development, not in their lifetime, not in mine, not in the lifetime of anyone who ever bought that land afterward. The restriction was now permanent, part of the public record, specifically built to outlast every person connected to it. My father had handed the signed instrument back to Neil and said, quietly, that's the right thing. My mother had gathered her coat and said, now it's decided. They walked out of that office with the particular posture of people who had made a difficult decision and discovered the difficulty resolves the moment the decision is actually made. I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes after they left, thinking about my own job and whether I had ever seen its purpose as clearly as I saw it in that parking lot. I decided I had not until that exact afternoon. My parents did not tell Dale. I have asked myself many times since whether they should have, and whether I should have, and my honest answer each time is that I don't know. What I know is that they made the decision themselves, as the legal owners of the land, and did not believe they needed Dale's permission to decide what happened to their own property during their own lifetimes. They had made their choice. It was in the public record. Any future title search would find it. What I have thought about more, in the years since, is what it was like to carry that knowledge for 3 years, while also sitting at a family table twice a year, pretending there was nothing particular to know. It is an unusual position, being the keeper of a document that will eventually affect everyone, that is already settled, that you did not place yourself, but helped 2 people place on their own land. I did not conceal it exactly. I never lied about it when asked. I was simply never asked, because in families where both parents are alive and reasonably healthy, the question of what happens to the land afterward tends to get deferred indefinitely. We deferred it. The instrument sat in the county recorder's records the entire time, accessible, findable, part of the public chain of title, waiting for the moment someone would need to find it. That is what recorded instruments are built to do. My father died in March, 3 years later. He was 78. His heart had been doing less of its own work for a couple of years by then, and he died at home, the way he'd wanted to. My mother died 11 months after that, in February. She'd been sick since September, a fast-moving cancer that didn't give her long to prepare, and she spent those months in a way I can only describe as very like her. She organized her finances, made her calls, left careful notes around the kitchen for things she wanted us to remember, and worked on a patchwork quilt on the days she had the energy to sit at the table. She started it in late September and worked on it through October and into November, mornings mostly, at the kitchen table, in the good light through the east window. I was there for many of those mornings. I sat across from her and drank coffee, and we talked, sometimes a great deal and sometimes almost not at all, and I watched her hands move through the squares, and I did not once bring up the easement, or Dale, or what might happen afterward. It didn't feel like the right conversation for those particular mornings. What she wanted was to make the quilt, and what I wanted was to be there while she did it, and that is what we did, for as many mornings as she had left. She died in February with 4 squares unfinished. I brought the quilt home afterward and set it in my guest room because I couldn't give it away and didn't know what else to do with it. The funeral was small, the way she'd wanted it, just the people who'd actually known her, not the wider circle who'd have come out of obligation. June Pickett brought a casserole and stayed to help with dishes afterward, the way she'd been doing at that house for 40 years by then. Dale gave a short, genuine eulogy about our father teaching him to drive the old truck around the back field before he was legally old enough to drive anywhere else. I didn't speak. I sat in the front pew with the folder of her final paperwork already half organized in my head, because that is apparently what grief does to a person who spends her working life around instruments and records. It hands you a task to hold on to, and you hold on to it, gratefully, because the alternative is having nothing to hold at all. The estate took the standard several months to settle. Neil handled most of it, since he already knew the property and the family, and the process was uneventful in every way except the one that mattered. The will divided the property in a way that surprised me. I had assumed the farmstead would come to us equally. Instead, my mother left it entirely to Dale. I received the liquid assets, savings, retirement, a small investment account. In total, the values weren't far apart, and I have thought about their reasoning enough to believe I understand it. They knew the property's market value, they were trying to create a fair division on paper, and they left the land itself to Dale because they trusted the easement to be what the land actually needed, regardless of who held the deed. They didn't need to leave it to the one who'd helped place the restriction. The restriction was already there, doing its work quietly, attached to the ground itself rather than to any particular owner. The 11 months between my mother's funeral and that phone call were quiet ones. Dale and Tina came out twice, once for the reading of the will, once in July, to walk the property and talk vaguely about what they might eventually do with it. On that July visit, Dale walked the fence line with me the way we used to as kids, and he stood at the east end by the meadow for a while, not saying much, and I remember thinking, watching him, that some of the old fluency was still in him somewhere, buried under a decade of not needing it. He asked me, that day, what I thought they should do with the place long term. I told him the honest answer, which was that I hoped it would stay in the family, in whatever form that took, but that I understood he and Tina had a life 3 hours away and 2 kids in a school district they liked, and that I wasn't going to pretend the calculus was simple for him the way it was simple for me. He said he appreciated me saying that. I believed him. I still believe he meant it, that day, in July, standing at that fence. What changed between July and April, as far as I can tell, was mostly practical and unglamorous. A roof estimate on the farmhouse that came in higher than expected, a property tax reassessment, a conversation with a financial planner about their kids' college funds that apparently included the specific phrase, underutilized asset. I don't say this to make Dale sound calculating, because I don't think he was, exactly. I think he was doing what a lot of people do with a piece of property they didn't ask for and don't have the bandwidth to actively steward from 3 hours away. He was looking at a spreadsheet instead of a fence line, and a spreadsheet will tell you a very different story than the one the land tells you in person. I found out about Dale's listing in the second week of April. He called on a Sunday evening to tell me, not to ask. He and Tina had decided the property made more sense as capital than as land they rarely used. He'd spoken to an agent who'd connected him with a developer named Carter Lund, whose company was planning a residential project in the county. Carter Lund was offering $1.7 million for the 22 acres. Dale said it was a reasonable price. He said he wanted me to know before the listing went public. He asked if I had questions. I said yes, one question. I asked whether he'd run a title search on the property before accepting the offer. He said the developer had handled due diligence. I asked whether he'd personally reviewed the title report. He said he'd reviewed the summary. I said that's what I thought, and asked him to call Neil Ash in the morning, and told him there was something on the title he needed to know about before this went any further. He asked what. I said I'd rather he hear it from Neil than from me, on the phone, on a Sunday night. The title company found the easement on a Thursday during their standard search of the county recorder's records. The same kind of search I run for a living. The same public record my parents had deliberately placed themselves inside 3 years earlier. Their attorney called Carter Lund that afternoon. Carter Lund called Dale Friday morning. Dale called me Friday evening, and I could hear in his voice the specific quality of someone who's had a very bad 48 hours and isn't finished having them yet. "You need to explain what this is," he said. "It's a conservation easement," I said. "Mom and Dad placed it on the property 3 years before they died. It restricts subdivision. The 14-lot development isn't possible." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said several things I won't repeat, and was quiet again. Then, "Did you know?" I said yes. I'd helped them through the process. It was part of my work. "And you didn't tell me." I said. "They asked me not to. It was their land and their decision to make." He didn't say anything else for a while after that. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone and listened to my brother breathe on the other end of the line, and I thought about how strange it is to be the person who has to tell someone that a decision they believed was still theirs to make was actually settled years before they knew there was a decision on the table at all. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that, because I think it would be easy to tell this story as though I'd been sitting on some private satisfaction for 3 years, waiting for the moment it would land. I hadn't. I had mostly just been carrying it, the way you carry any piece of knowledge that belongs to someone else's family business as much as your own. What I felt on that call was closer to grief arriving a second time, in a different shape, the specific grief of watching my brother lose an option he never actually had, and having to be the one who told him so. "I need a few days," Dale said, finally. "I need to figure out what this means for the offer, for Carter Lund, for, I don't even know what else yet." I told him to take whatever time he needed, and that Neil would walk him through every part of it as many times as he needed to hear it. He didn't say anything else for a while after that. He wanted a meeting, everything explained in person, documents on the table, Neil Ash present to answer questions. I told him that was reasonable. Neil agreed to meet at the farmstead on a Saturday morning in May. Neil has been doing this work about as long as I have. He is precise in the way good land use attorneys are precise, which is different from the way courtroom attorneys are precise. Less theater, more patience, a willingness to let a document simply be correct and let that correctness do the talking. In the 2 days before the meeting, he prepared a full packet for Dale. The recorded instrument itself, the county's notation confirming its validity, a plain language summary of what it restricted and what it didn't, and a short memo addressing every question Dale had already asked on the phone, so that nothing in the meeting would need to be improvised. I asked him, the night before, whether he thought Dale would accept it more easily with all of that laid out in advance. He said he didn't know, and that it wasn't really the point. The point, he said, is that nobody in that field tomorrow gets to say the process wasn't fair even if they don't like where it lands. I have thought about that sentence often since. I want to be clear about what that meeting actually was, because I think it matters to how the rest of this lands. By the time we all stood in that field, the reveal itself had already happened, off in the distance, inside a title company's records room, days earlier, entirely on paper, with no one present to react to it. What happened at the farmstead wasn't the discovery. It was everyone else finally catching up to what the county's own records had already been saying since April, 3 years prior. If you have ever watched someone find out, secondhand and too late, about a decision that was already made honestly and recorded properly, and simply waiting in plain sight the whole time, stay with me. What happened that Saturday morning is the part of this story I've thought about most since. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight, and subscribe if you haven't yet, so the rest of it finds you. Now, back to the farmstead. I drove out to the farmstead the Friday evening before the meeting. I told myself I was checking the condition of the property, which is a reasonable thing for a land trust director to say out loud. But that was not the actual reason. The actual reason was that I needed to see the meadow before I had a conversation about the meadow. I parked at the lane and walked the fence line in the late light. The May sequence was just beginning. The early species up first. The prairie grasses already knee-high. The coneflowers a week or so from opening. My mother's planting logic was still legible in it, if you knew how to read it. Early to late, color to color. The whole coming summer already written into the first 2 weeks of May. I stood at the east end of the fence for a long time. A red-tailed hawk was working the south field, back and forth over the same strip of ground, with the patient attention of something that already knows exactly what's down there and is simply waiting for the right moment. I watched it until it was too dark to see, then drove home and slept, and in the morning I drove back. The farmstead in May looks the way it has looked every May of my life. The apple tree at the corner of the barn was past bloom. The kitchen garden my mother planted was coming back on its own, the way perennial things do, whether or not anyone tends them. The meadow along the east fence was 2 weeks into its spring sequence, the 30-foot strip of color running the full length of the property line, exactly the way it has since my mother laid it out the 3rd year after they bought the place. Carter Lund was already there when Neil and I arrived, a careful-looking man in his early 50s, the kind of developer who has navigated enough complications to know how to read a room before he says anything in it. Dale was there with Tina, who stood at the edge of things looking at the meadow the way people look at scenery when they need somewhere to put their eyes that isn't the conversation in front of them. I had also asked June Pickett to come. She farms the adjacent property and had known my parents since the early 80s, and she had been nearby, dropping something off from her garden, on the actual morning they signed. I thought her presence might say something documents alone couldn't. She stood near the barn fence, mostly quiet, but there. "Just explain it," Dale said. Neil Ash opened his briefcase. He has been the trust's attorney for 11 years and has sat through more of these conversations than I can count, and he handles all of them the same unhurried way. No theater, no editorializing, the document in hand, the relevant sections already marked. He set the conservation easement on the folding table we'd brought out and read the restrictions aloud. He pointed to the signatures: Henry Garrett, Bess Garrett, dated and notarized and properly witnessed. He explained the structure, recorded at the county recorder's office, running with the land, binding every future owner and transferee, regardless of the terms of any later sale, inheritance, or bequest. The 14-lot subdivision Carter Lund's company had designed wasn't possible. One residential structure, at the current footprint, was permitted. The meadow and the agricultural land were restricted from commercial development or subdivision in any configuration whatsoever. I watched Carter Lund while Neil read. He had arrived already holding his own attorney's report, so none of it was new information to him. What was new, I think, was hearing it read aloud in that actual field, with the meadow visible past Neil's shoulder, and the barn behind us, and my mother's kitchen garden coming back through the fence line on its own. Hearing the abstraction of a title report become an actual, specific, growing piece of ground. He held his copy carefully, with both hands, the way you hold something when you want to be seen taking it seriously. They never said anything, Dale said. They had the legal standing to make this decision about their own property without notifying anyone who didn't yet own it, Neil said. She's worked for this organization 14 years. She helped them do this. Yes, Neil said. They asked her to help them, and she helped them. A long silence. The meadow moved the way meadows move in May, the grasses leaning one direction and then correcting. June Pickett spoke, quietly, from the fence, not really addressing any one of us. Your mother knew exactly what she was doing that day, she said. I came by with tomatoes, and she was in her good coat, said she and Henry had an appointment, and she was about as settled as I ever saw her about anything. Then she went back to looking at the meadow. Carter Lund cleared his throat, still holding the report. I've been doing this 26 years, he said, and this is the first time I've been at one of these where I could actually see what the decision was about. He said it plainly, without irony, like a man arriving somewhere he hadn't expected to arrive. Nobody responded, and he didn't seem to need anyone to. I asked him, weeks later, on a call about the closing logistics for the acquisition, what had actually changed his mind between the Friday he first heard about the easement and the Saturday he stood in that field. He thought about it for a moment before answering. I've killed a lot of deals over paperwork, he said. Easements, wetlands designations, historic overlays. Usually it just feels like an obstacle somebody forgot to mention. This was the first time I stood on the actual ground and understood the obstacle was the point. Somebody built something out there on purpose and wanted it kept. That's not the same as a permitting delay. I told him that was, more or less, exactly what my job was for, helping people see the difference between an obstacle and a purpose before the bulldozers made the distinction irrelevant. He laughed, a short, genuine laugh, and said he'd remember that the next time his own team complained about a title search turning up more than they wanted it to. Then Neil did one more thing. He reached into his briefcase and produced a folded piece of paper. Your parents left this with me the day they executed the instrument, he said. They asked me to hold it until the document's existence was no longer something they intended to keep private. I thought this qualified. He unfolded it and read it aloud. We are doing this because the land is the most honest thing we have owned, and we want it to stay honest. Whoever reads this later should know that we understood what we were deciding, and that we decided it together, on purpose. My mother's handwriting. I had seen it hundreds of times, on recipe cards and labels and the backs of envelopes and the margins of seed catalogs. I had never seen this particular page. She'd written it the morning they signed and handed it to Neil and never once mentioned it to me in the 3 years after. Dale didn't say anything for a long time. He walked 10 feet off from the table, toward the barn, and stood there looking at it. Tina watched him. June looked at the meadow. Carter Lund looked at his hands. I looked at nothing in particular. I was thinking about my mother at that closing table with Neil, writing that note on the morning she signed, handing it to him, never once mentioning it to me, keeping it, deliberately, for the exact moment it would eventually be needed. She understood precisely what she was doing, all the way through. The meeting ended without resolution that morning. Carter Lund had his attorney verify the easement's scope and confirm no variance process existed. The answer, which came in writing the following week, was exactly what I already knew it would be. The easement is what it says it is. It is not reviewable, negotiable, or subject to variance by any party for any reason. It runs with the land. Carter Lund called Dale 2 weeks later with a different proposal. He was still interested in the property, not as a subdivision now, but as a conservation acquisition. His company had recently partnered with a regional environmental fund looking for agricultural land with documented meadow and open field habitat. The offer was considerably lower, $480,000, reflecting the land's value as a residential holding without development upside. He'd keep the farmhouse intact as a rental. The meadow would remain untouched, he said, with what struck me as genuine and slightly surprised honesty that he'd become interested in the conservation story itself once he understood it. A man who'd done the math and found a workable number in a direction he had not originally set out to go. If you've ever had to wait for someone else to walk all the way around a hard truth before they could finally accept it, not pushed, not argued into it, just given the room to arrive there on their own timeline, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And subscribe if this kind of quiet, document-driven justice is the kind of story you come back for, because there's more of it coming. Now, back to that week of waiting. It took Dale a week to give his answer. During that week, I got one text from him on a Wednesday afternoon. "Did you go out there to see the meadow before the meeting?" I wrote back, "Yes." He didn't reply that day. He called Friday evening and said he'd accepted Carter Lund's revised offer. He said it the way someone says something after working through a difficult stretch and arriving somewhere he hadn't wanted to land but could live with. "I think they were right," he said, without elaborating, and I didn't ask him to. It was not what he'd expected when he inherited the farmstead. It was also the number that reflected what the farmstead actually was, which is what my father told me, at that kitchen table, was the correct way to think about it all along. Dale and I have talked about that conversation many times since. Some of the talks have been difficult, some have been quieter and better. I don't want to suggest a piece of legal paperwork repaired years of distance between us, because it didn't, not by itself. What it did was force an actual conversation about what our parents valued and why. And those conversations have been, slowly, more useful to us than the difficult ones that came before them. Dale and I have had a longer series of conversations over the years since, ones I wouldn't call easy and wouldn't call finished either. We've talked about what our parents valued and why. We've talked about how our different relationships to the farm shaped our different assumptions about what it was actually for. He told me, on a phone call in July, that for a long time after the meeting, he thought he was angry at me, but that when he tried to locate exactly what the anger was about, it kept moving on him. "I think I was angry that they'd already decided," he said. "I think I wanted to be part of the decision." I told him that seemed like a reasonable thing to want. "Were you part of it?" he asked. I said I had helped them execute what they'd already chosen. I hadn't chosen it for them. He was quiet a while. Then, "That's what you do." He meant my job, that I help people carry out decisions they've already made, not make the decisions for them. He was right. "Yes," I said, "that's what I do." We sat quietly on the phone together for a bit after that, not a comfortable quiet, an honest one. I've come to think that's the thing worth reaching for when the comfortable kind isn't available yet. I want to say something honestly here that I have not said to Dale directly, though I suspect he has guessed most of it. There was a version of that spring where I could have made this easier on him. I could have called him the day I learned about the listing and explained everything gently, in private, before Carter Lund's title company ever ran its search, before an attorney's letter made it feel institutional and cold. I decided against it, and I want to explain why, because I don't think the reason was unkind, even though I understand it might have felt that way to him at the time. My parents chose to let the public record do this work. They recorded that instrument specifically so that it would exist independently of any conversation, so that it would hold, regardless of who remembered to mention it or when. If I had stepped in and softened the discovery myself, I would have been quietly overriding the exact mechanism they built, the idea that the land's protection didn't depend on any one person's goodwill or good timing, mine included. I let the record speak first, because that is what they designed it to do. I only stepped in afterward to help everyone understand what it had already said. That is a fine distinction, I recognize. I am not certain Dale has ever fully accepted it as a reasonable one, and I don't know that he owes me his acceptance of it. But it is the honest reason, and this story doesn't mean much to me if I only tell the parts that make me look gentle. Something else changed in Dale that I did not expect and want to record honestly, because it is the part of this story that surprised me the most. He started calling Neil directly, on his own, with questions about how easements work more generally, not about our parents' instrument specifically, which was settled and no longer needed explaining, but about the mechanism itself, the way it's drafted, the way it holds up over decades, the way other families use it. Neil mentioned this to me almost in passing, months later, and I found myself sitting with it for a long time afterward. My brother, who had spent 20 years as the sibling who left, who read the land as a spreadsheet line the spring he needed it to be one, had become someone quietly curious about the exact legal architecture that had taken the decision out of his hands. I don't fully understand what to make of that yet. I think perhaps some people need to lose a form of control before they become interested in how it actually works. I placed the 48th conservation easement in Millhaven County that September. The landowners were a family who'd farmed an orchard property for 3 generations, with no interest in selling and every interest in making sure no one could ever force the question after they were gone. I sat at their closing table and walked them through the instrument the way I've walked 47 families through it before them. I explained that the document runs with the land permanently, binding their children, their grandchildren, any buyer who ever comes after, under any circumstances of sale or inheritance. No reversing it, ever. The landowner, a woman of 61 who'd been taking her own notes on a legal pad the way my father once had, set her pen down when I finished and said, "That's what we want. We want it decided now, while we're still the ones who get to decide." I thought about my father's kitchen table. I thought about that legal pad. "Let's get you signed," I said. "The quilt is in my guest room now, on the bed, under the window that faces the field. Frances Abbott is a quilter I found through an online fiber arts group, someone I've never met in person, who lives about an hour from here." I sent her a photograph of my mother's quilt and explained it was 4 squares short. She asked about the fabrics already in it, the colors, the weight, the piecing pattern. I described them as best I could. She said she thought she understood what had been intended. She finished the 4 squares and mailed them to me in November with a note that read, "I think I got them close." She had. The quilt is whole now. My mother would have looked at it, moved 2 squares, and then agreed it was right. That's what she would have done, and it's the fact about the quilt I most want to be true. Carter Lund's conservation acquisition closed in January. The farmhouse is a residential rental now, occupied by a family with 2 kids who use the barn to store bicycles and various outdoor equipment, which is more or less exactly what a barn should be used for. The meadow is still the meadow. Carter Lund partnered with a habitat organization that documents its species composition every spring now, which means the meadow my mother designed by hand is officially on a monitoring list, and someone at a university somewhere receives a report about it every year for the foreseeable future. June Pickett told me this when I drove past in April. She said she could see the monitoring stakes from her own fence line. She said it approvingly, the way she says most things, with the ease of someone who's been watching that land long enough to recognize when it's finally being properly looked after again. I drove past the farmstead again on a Tuesday morning in May. the morning after a long work week, just to see how the meadow was coming in. I parked at the lane and walked to the fence and stood there for about 10 minutes. The sequence my mother designed was running exactly as she'd intended, the way it has every May for more than 4 decades now. The ironweed was coming. The coneflowers were a few days off. The prairie grasses moved in the light the way they've moved every May since she planted them in the 3rd year of her life on that land. I think about this often now, more than I expected to a year ago. How much of what lasts in a family isn't the argument you win or the property you keep, but the specific, patient work of making sure something true gets written down clearly enough that it survives whoever happens to be in the room when it finally gets read. My mother did that with a legal instrument. She also did it, it turns out, with a needle and thread and a note folded into an attorney's file, and an afternoon spent walking a meadow out loud with 2 children who weren't really listening at the time. Some of what she wrote down took 40 years to be understood. I don't think she minded waiting. The easement will not expire. The meadow will continue. My mother knew this the moment she set her pen down on the instrument and handed it to Neil. That was always the whole point of doing it. Not to win an argument with a future she wouldn't be alive to see, but simply to make sure the argument never had to happen at all, for anyone, ever again, on that particular 30 feet of ground. Tina called me in May, on her own, without Dale knowing at first. She asked if she could come out to the farmstead sometime, just the 2 of us, before everything with the sale finalized. I said of course. She came out on a Tuesday, and I walked her through the whole property the way I'd once have walked a stranger through it. The barn, the well, the kitchen garden, the meadow, and she asked real questions this time, the kind she'd never asked in 16 years, and wrote some of the answers down in a small notebook she'd brought for exactly that purpose. Near the end, she told me she felt embarrassed that it had taken losing the option to buy it that made her actually want to understand it. I told her I didn't think embarrassment was the useful part of that feeling, and that showing up with a notebook mattered more than the timing of it. She has since become, unexpectedly, one of the people I talk to most about the farm. More, some months, than Dale himself. Dale brought his kids out to the farmhouse in June, the first time either of them had visited since they were small enough not to remember it. His daughter is 11 now, old enough to ask real questions, and she walked the meadow with me for the better part of an hour, while Dale and the renter's kids tried to coax the barn cat out from under the porch. She asked me what every single plant was called. I told her as many as I still remembered, which was more than I expected, my mother's Sunday afternoon recitation apparently having lodged somewhere permanent in me after all. Near the end of the walk, she asked why nobody had ever told her the farm had a name for every single thing growing in it. I told her that some things only get named out loud when somebody finally asks. She thought about that for a while, the way careful 11-year-olds do, and then she asked if she could come back in August to see what was blooming by then. I told her absolutely, anytime, and I meant it in a way that surprised me a little, standing there, some version of the same promise my mother made to that meadow in 1972, being handed forward, without either of us quite planning it, to somebody new. I work from home on Fridays, and the guest room sits across the hall from where I work, and sometimes I glance through the open door and see the quilt on the bed and think about what my parents understood, long before I fully did, about the difference between value and worth. A piece of land has a market value, and it has a worth, and the two are not always the same number, and the instrument that keeps them permanently different is a document you can sign on an ordinary Tuesday morning, at your own initiative, because you already know what the land is actually for, and you want to say so in writing, in a way built to hold. I tell a slightly different version of my opening speech to landowners now than I did before that spring. I still walk them through every restriction, every provision, every consequence for the people who come after them, exactly as thoroughly as I always did, but I've started adding one thing at the end that I never used to say out loud, because I hadn't yet lived through needing to say it. I tell them, consider deciding, now, whether you want your family to hear this from you directly, in your own words, while you're still here to answer their questions, or whether you're comfortable letting the recorded instrument speak for itself later, on its own schedule, to whoever eventually needs to read it. Both are legitimate choices. My parents made the second one, for reasons I understood and ultimately respected, and it cost my brother a hard spring finding out secondhand what could have been a hard afternoon at a kitchen table 3 years earlier. I don't tell landowners which choice to make. I just tell them, now, that it is a choice, and that it's worth making on purpose rather than by default. If there is something in your life that someone else would convert into capital if you let them, and you already know exactly what it's actually for, this is for you. Decisions made honestly and recorded properly reach much further than the people who make them. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. And subscribe. I will see you in the next one.